Today in the Great Lakes Kitchen, we're making one of my absolute favorites, the most creamy, savory, delicious mushroom risotto. Now, for the longest time, I had it in my head that risotto was a particularly difficult dish to make, and trying to reflect back on it, I can't really come up with a good reason to why I thought that. The best I can come up with is probably a decade or more of watching Gordon Ramsay scream at people on Kitchen Nightmares about screwing up the risotto they were making for dinner service. But once I actually learned the right way to make it and have been doing so ever since, I can't believe I ever thought that it was out of my reach to create a delicious homemade risotto. So there's a few ingredients and a few steps that you pretty much have to follow, but none of them are crazy or overly difficult. So let's get right into it and whip up a batch of what I think is the most delicious mushroom risotto I've ever eaten. As always, let's get started by taking a look at our ingredients. Of course, we have some arborio rice, then chicken broth, olive oil, cremini mushrooms, also called baby bella mushrooms, fresh Parmesan cheese, a little bit of white wine, some butter, kosher salt, black pepper, a shallot, and green onion. A quick note about the rice. It really is imperative to use the right type of rice for making a proper risotto. Arborio rice is the gold standard for risotto, both because it can absorb so much liquid and flavor, and because while cooking it releases a lot of starches that result in a creamy, smooth, delicious risotto. Now, once we really get going in cooking our rice, we need to be tending to it almost constantly. So I'm going to get all of my ingredients prepped before cooking anything. I'll chop up 2 or 3 green onion stalks very finely. Fresh chives would also work very nicely here, but I happen to prefer green onion just a little bit more for this recipe. Next, I'll finely chop 1 full shallot. A quick note, a shallot is comprised of 2 or 3 large cloves per bulb, so when I say 1 full shallot, I'm talking about the whole thing. I'll peel it, cut it long ways into thin slices, and then mince those slices into small bits. Now onto the cremini mushrooms. I bought sliced mushrooms, so there is minimal chopping needed. I'm just going to find any particularly large slices and give them 1 or 2 quick chops. I want decent pieces of mushroom, but I don't want any especially huge chunks in there. Next, I'll grate some of that Parmesan cheese. For a batch this size, I'll grate about a half a cup. One last thing to do before really getting into this. We have to heat up the chicken broth. For this batch, I'm using 4 cups, or 1 quart, of chicken broth. In a small saucepan, I'll bring the broth up to a simmer. We want to keep this broth simmering hot the whole time. Now we're finally ready to start making this risotto. I've got my larger saucepan on another burner, and I'm going to heat up a couple tablespoons of olive oil and 1 tablespoon of butter. When the butter is melted, I'll throw in my 1 pound of sliced mushrooms, and I'll stir and saute these until they're soft, about 5 minutes. At this point, I need to remove the mushrooms from the pan and set them aside. We'll add those back in later. And while I want to get the mushrooms out of there, I don't want to remove the bit of liquid that's in the pan. So I'll use this big slotted spoon thing to scoop the mushrooms out and leave that mixture of oil, butter, and mushroom liquid behind. Now for another small splash of olive oil, about another tablespoon. Then I'm tossing in the minced shallot and sauteing for just a minute. These tiny bits of shallot will cook very fast and I don't want to burn them. Next, I'm adding 1 cup of dry arborio rice. I'll mix that in with the shallots and oil in the pan and keep stirring a bit for a minute or 2. I want to just barely start to toast that rice, but I definitely don't want to scorch it or the shallots. And now for the wine. I'll deglaze with 5 tablespoons of dry white wine, or just under a quarter of a cup. I think a dry Pinot Grigio works very nice for a risotto, so that's what I'm using. Once the wine is completely absorbed and or cooked off, we're finally ready for that broth. Using a ladle, I'll add a half cup of that hot broth to the risotto and stir. Stir slowly and constantly until most of that broth has either soaked in or cooked off. Then ladle in another half cup of broth and stir constantly until most of that is either soaked in or cooked off. Keep repeating this until all the broth has been added. This is the longest and most tedious step. Expect to stand there, ladling and stirring, for a good 15 minutes. This is probably the part of risotto making that some people find daunting. There's nothing difficult about this, it only requires some patience. After adding the final ladle of broth, stir and cook until the consistency of your risotto is creamy and there is still just a little bit of liquid in the pan. At this point, turn off the heat and immediately stir in another tablespoon of butter, the Parmesan cheese, green onion, salt, and pepper. Finally, let's not forget about those mushrooms. It's up to you whether you want to stir the mushrooms into the risotto or serve them on top. For the sake of presentation in this video, I'll serve them on top, but normally I would just mix them right in because it seems a little easier. And that's it. If you've never had a proper risotto, you're probably looking at this and thinking it just looks like a plate of rice and mushrooms. But I promise you the flavor is worth the effort. The creamy, tender rice has just the right amount of chew to it and is soaked in all the flavors of that shallot, wine, and broth. Finished off with the scallion and Parmesan cheese, it's simply delicious and satisfying. It's one of my absolute favorite things to make, either as a side dish or a main course. A big bowl of mushroom risotto topped with slices of grilled chicken breast for dinner makes me a happy guy. So that's it for now. Be sure to like and subscribe to stay up to date on all our latest stuff, including future cooking videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time right here in the Great Lakes Kitchen.